want on your side. Mark, why don't you give a little bit about yourself?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having Coke here. It's an honor to be here. And I'm General Counsel, Senior Vice President of Coke Industries. Been with the company 20 years. And we are heavily involved and very much a part of the criminal justice reform movement. We have been for many years, and we're very excited to be part of what's going on. And hopefully we're going to talk about it in a lot of detail today, what we think is going to happen at the federal level, what better happen at the federal level, and hopefully get some great reforms that can help make people's lives better. That's the bottom line. So, but thank you very much for having us here today.
I'm going to get out of your hair, folks, and turn it over to a gentleman that over the last 20 years has been a personal mentor. You know what a personal mentor is? When you think you're right and they know you're wrong, and they listen to you anyway. My dear friend, Curly Dossman.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. And good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's my pleasure to serve as your moderator for this afternoon's workshop session. As you know, this session, Uniting for Progress and Opportunity, as we're looking at this issue, we're really excited about that. So we want to really start with talking about Uniting for Progress and Opportunity, bipartisan efforts to reform criminal justice system. There's the title of this session today. And you know, the United States makes up 5% of the world's population, but houses 25% of the world's prison population. And with more than 2 million people in prison, at a cost to taxpayers and about $80 billion a year, and an estimated 4,500 federal criminal laws on the books, the United States doesn't need to be tougher on crime. We need to be smarter on crime. Overcriminalization and over-incarceration have not made America safer. Instead, they have devastated families and communities, increased poverty, and hurt those who can least afford it. And so the need for reform is urgent, and the time is now. Our panelists today will discuss their involvement in bipartisan criminal justice reform efforts that's underway in both state houses across this country and on Capitol Hill. Many of you know recently President Obama called for an overhaul of the criminal justice system. He also emphasized that the vast majority of prisoners will eventually be released and need more programs to help them re-enter society and to remove barriers to employment and voting. Our House lawmakers are holding hearings on the Safe Justice Act, which could accomplish some of these goals. It was introduced by Congressman John Sensenbrenner and Democrat Bobby Scott. And so today we'd like to hear from our panelists with respect to the efforts that are going on this topic. And I'm going to, since they've already been introduced, I'm going to start with our first question. And Norm, I think I'm going to start with you. What exactly is the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers? Who are your members? And what is your perspective on the state of criminal justice reform in the United States?
Thanks very much, Curly, and I'm very honored to be invited to be a part of this conference. It's really a great privilege for me. So who are we? We have something called the Sixth Amendment, and that Sixth Amendment says that every person who's accused of a crime has the right to counsel. So my organization is an organization of people whose jobs is defined by the United States Constitution. And we are the people, for the last 3 or 4 decades, we're lawyers who are in small firms, medium-sized firms, big firms, military lawyers. We are the people over the last several decades who have stood in the wells of courtrooms throughout this country and seen the tragedy of our criminal justice nightmare unfold. I practiced law, as I said, for 28 years. I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of my clients were poor, minorities. They were disproportionately arrested. They were disproportionately held in custody before trial. They were disproportionately sentenced to harsher sentences. That is the reality of what has happened with our criminal justice system in this country. I just want to give a few numbers to contextualize it. give it a little bit more context in terms of how we got here, and then pass it along. We, as you heard, incarcerate at any given time anywhere between 2.1 and 2.3 million people, more than any other country on earth. But do you know that we arrest 14 million people a year in this country? Do you know that there are 70 million adults that have a criminal history in the United States? Do you know that there are 55,000 collateral consequences? Those are the things that aren't part of the sentence, that affect people's lives forever in all realms of endeavor. Now, here's what I want to talk about in terms of context, and here's why I'm very optimistic that we're at a moment in time that may only come along once in a person's lifetime. We got to this problem because politicians from every political outlook, from the right to the left to the middle, became intoxicated with the idea that the criminal justice system could fix every problem. That everything we didn't like about how people behave, we could fix with the criminal justice system. That was a big mistake. It was a Nixon mistake, a Bush mistake, a Reagan mistake. It was a Bill Clinton mistake, as he now, to his great credit, admits. And I'll tell you something else. On the federal side, one of the worst pieces of legislation ever enacted was the federal sentencing guidelines, which until a few years ago were mandatory guidelines. That was the handiwork of Senator Hatch, a conservative, and Senator Ted Kennedy. We got here because they all took us here, but now they're all going to have to get together to take us out. And that's why I'm pleased to be on this panel, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity to talk to you about how we can seize this moment, this rare moment in this most divisive period in our history politically, where people are coming together on this issue. This is indeed, it's the social justice issue, certainly of my lifetime. Since we put legalized segregation behind us, fixing the criminal justice system, a broken criminal justice system, is our cause, and we have to embrace it.
I feel I mentioned one housekeeping note. As the panelists I'm asking questions and they're responding. If you really have questions as we go along, would you please kind of write those questions down? And Pat, where are you? She has some notes, and then you can raise your hand. She'll give those to you. And then you can prepare your question and give them back to her, and then we'll have in our last about 15 minutes of the session, we'll open it up and entertain those questions that you have, okay? With that, Lauren, you've been following this initiative for quite some time, so tell me, why does the criminal justice system need reforming, and whose responsibility is it to rehabilitate it from your perspective?
Well, the same people who got us to this place in the first place, as Sean was correctly outlined. When it comes to bad criminal justice policy, it all happens a little bit at a time, particularly with regard to mandatory minimums. They don't just happen at once, they happen over a series of years. And, we on both sides of the aisle see it where politicians want to prove that they're tough on crime and tough on people, especially they add mandatory minimums to bills, and it just gets worse down the line. Obviously, in this case, in America's case, it started really with the Rockefeller drug laws. It got worse with during Reagan. It got worse with the Clinton crime bill. And as Norman just said, that was some of the politicians who were responsible for the Clinton crime bill still walking around today. Charles Schumer is probably going to be the next majority leader of the U.S. Senate, and he was a major player in the Clinton crime bill. Unfortunately, Joe Biden was a major player in the Clinton crime bill. At the NAACP convention last week, or 2 weeks ago, Bill Clinton, President Clinton, admitted that he had made some major mistakes with regard to finally admitted that he'd made some mistakes with regard to his crime bill. Now, people at the time in Congress, some of the people I cover in the Congressional Black Caucus, knew that at the time. One of those people who knew it at the time was Bobby Scott, who was involved in the effort with regard to the Safe Justice Act. And the Safe Justice Act is something that would effectively not add any more mandatories to the code, which what ends up happening with mandatory minimums is they get added gradually through the years. So there's no one bill that can really sort of repeal them all at once. I should say no one bill that could repeal them all at once that would actually pass. there is actually a bill called the Justice Safety Valve Act that could repeal them, but that bill would be very unlikely to pass. So now we've gotten to a point with regard to criminal justice policy where we have Republicans and Democrats agreeing that something has to happen with regard to overcriminalization in the country. It's a very rare moment, you know, and to say that it's rare is an understatement. I've been covering Congress since the late 90s, 1998. I started covering the year of the Clinton impeachment. And I've never seen a situation where you get, you know, liberal Democrats in the same room as conservative Republicans on criminal justice policy. Last Friday, the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, got up and said that he wanted to see the Safe Justice Act come to the floor of the House. I mean, that doesn't happen. He doesn't mention, not only does he not mention justice policy in general, he certainly is not going to mention a specific bill. And as everybody knows in here, these are the same Republicans who blocked President Obama on everything out of hand without even knowing the details of what he stands for the first 5 years of his presidency. Now we see the Republicans coming around in a way that we've never seen them come around before. So effectively what's going on is a great deal of agreement on certain aspects of rolling back overcriminalization. And even though safe justice won't do everything, it's sort of a major first step forward. And I would advise everybody in here to be very specific about their public officials on these issues, particularly with regard to mandatory minimums, because politicians tend to get up in speeches on MSNBC, on panels, and say that they don't like mandatory minimums, they're against mandatory minimums, and then they'll vote for something with a mandatory minimum in it. We had a bill with regard to sex trafficking in May that passed with a new mandatory minimum in it, that people who've been on TV have said, oh, I'm against mandatory minimums. There's only 3 members of the House, really only 2 that I know of, that have never voted against the mandatory minimum. Bobby Scott and a new member named Tom Massey, which I'm sure none of you guys know, is a Republican in Kentucky, young Republican in Kentucky, who's never voted for a mandatory minimum. He specifically did not vote for the bill that just passed with the new mandatory because there was a mandatory minimum. That's pretty rare, you know, because there are some members who care about this so much that they're willing to search the entire piece of legislation. If they find a new mandatory minimum in it, they're not voting for that. There are not many people who can say that. So when you talk to your elected representatives, you got to be very specific about, you know, have you voted for something with a mandatory in it, and do you support this? Because what people say on TV and in panels, etc., and what they do with regard to voting is 2 different things. So you have to be very specific. It's difficult to do. You have to sometimes read the legislation. Sometimes it's not reported. You know, so it's very hard sometimes to find these things out. But one way to find out is to ask your elected representative, have you ever voted for a mandatory minimum? That's one way to find out. So I'll stop there.
So Mark, why is Coke involved in this issue of criminal justice reform? Is this a new issue for Coke, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Good afternoon. Coke's involved. The easiest way to say it is because we want to help remove impediments and barriers to opportunity for all Americans, particularly the poor and the disadvantaged. That's the simplest way to say it. Charles Coke is a classical liberal. What that means in English, so I can understand it, is that he believes in a limited government and expansive individual liberties as envisioned and contained in the Bill of Rights. So if your goalposts are 1, helping remove barriers to opportunity for the poor, and you believe in the Bill of Rights and individual liberty and freedom, you have to be in this fight, you have to be in this arena. Because there is no greater infringement on life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness in our criminal justice system. We see that every day. We've seen it for the last 30 years. We have a 2-tier system that is beneath us. If you're rich and guilty, you get a much better deal than if you're poor and innocent.
That's right.
That's beneath us as a people. That's beneath our ideals. It's not consistent with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, our founding fathers, they got a lot of things wrong, but they were sending us a message. 4 of the 10 amendments deal with criminal justice issues. 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th amendments. They were telling us, this is where it's coming from, the greatest government overreach. It will infringe your liberty. We're in that fight because of that. That's important to us. It's unjust. It's beneath us as a people. we need to do better, and we can do better, as Norman and Lauren have said, with the legislation that's out there. Personally, why am I involved? I work at Coke, and it's a major issue for all of us, particularly Charles, that's why. But also, I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. I paid for college for a couple of years. I was a prison guard. And what I saw there was basically the same two-tier system we're seeing now. There was a lot of poor kids, a lot of whom I went to high school and junior high with, who got caught in a cycle. Some of them were bad kids, some of them did some bad things. A lot of them just didn't have any guidance, any direction. Worcester's a blue-collar town, there wasn't maybe enough opportunities. I don't know, they didn't have the family support. They made mistakes, they didn't have connections, they didn't have money, they couldn't get out of it. And fast forward, one of them is in life in prison now. He became a much more successful criminal. Another one hung and hanged himself in prison. So the reality is, look, we all make our own choices. I'm not saying that they were victims of it. What I'm saying is if we had a better system, if our system, and I'm holding up a card here, was really going to be consistent with the Bill of Rights, to answer Curly's question about why we're involved and what our reforms are, we think there needs to be top to bottom comprehensive reform of our criminal justice system. Because it's not working. What we have decided to call criminal behavior and then go after people for really probably shouldn't be criminal behavior. We shouldn't be criminalizing to begin with. And then once we charge someone with a crime, how does that work, the grand jury process? It's not working like it's supposed to be. The grand jury process, when it was started in the 1790s, the whole idea was to be a check against arbitrary action by the government against individual freedom and liberty. The citizens in that grand jury are supposed to guard against that. It's now a rubber stamp. We see what happens. 98% of cases, criminal cases, settle. The trial penalty is play. You end up getting loaded up with charges. You're facing 50 or 60 years in prison. You end up, no mas, I'm going to just take the plea. I'll just plead to a minor felony. Nothing minor about it. You get probation. You get a few years in prison. You have really limited your life's options. We're also very focused on the middle box, which is the court system, how that works, particularly for indigents, people who are poor. The Sixth Amendment, as Norman talked about, says that if you're accused of a crime, you shall enjoy, it says enjoy in there, enjoy the defense of a criminal lawyer, when the government's trying to take your life, liberty, and property. That is a false promise these days. None of these programs are funded in any meaningful way at the state level. They are at the federal level. We need to fix this. Sentencing, as Lauren mentioned, is a mess. We need to fix that. And the last piece is collateral consequences. What happens when people pay their debt to society, serve their sentence? Do we welcome them back? Are they returning citizens? No. There's stigma from them. Can't get a job. Can't get a loan, student loan, business loan. You can't live with your family if they're in assisted living if you have a criminal record. You can go on and on. Norman said there's 40, 50,000 collateral consequences. But what we've decided to do as a society, over-criminalize certain behavior, overcharge it, over-sentence, over-incarcerate, overburden on the way out. In our prison system, I'll stop here because I can keep going, that needs to be reformed. Our prison system is a mess. We have too many people who don't belong there because they're not violent criminals, so they maybe made a mistake. A lot of them are probably innocent, but they didn't have lawyers. We also have a lot of mentally ill people. We have 10 times the number of mentally ill people in prison than we do in mental hospitals. We're, as Lauren said, as Norman said, we're using our criminal justice system for things that we really don't need to use it for. We need to fix all of that, and our prison system should have one job and one job only. They have custody, stewardship, responsibility for these individuals. Make them better in prison, so when they get out, they're not coming back in. And if there's recidivism, if that's happening, then we need to change the prison management. We need to make these people better. We need to have programs in prison. We need to welcome them back. The bottom line is, and I'll shut up after this, is it gets back to Brian Stevenson, who I'm sure some of you are aware of in this room, the Equal Justice Alliance Initiative, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And we all need to have that humility and grace within ourselves and welcome people back. And if we can fix our system from the laws that are passed to how we let people re-enter, that'll be a good thing. And I think some of the bills we're talking about, including the Safe Justice Act, hopefully will accomplish that. Thank you.
Ben, let me ask you, how is the NNPA involved in the current criminal justice reform efforts and these discussions?
Thank you very much. First, I want to Brother Curley, say a word about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I don't think there's another national organization in America that would have this panel to start off its national convention. So I think we all should express a word of gratitude to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. To Dr. Charles Steele, the president, to Dr. Bernard Lafayette, the chairman of the board. I just want to say that I would not be here today if it were not for SCLC. I'm not talking about here in Baton Rouge, I'm talking about in life. I started out in the civil rights movement over 50 years ago as a young youth organizer under Golden Franks, who was the state field secretary of North Carolina at the time. And so I grew up in the movement. And a good thing about this conference, I see so many young people out in the audience. You are our future. And we need to regenerate what is known as the civil rights movement. Because of the urgency of criminal justice reform, there's no such thing as a post-racial America. There's no such thing as a post-civil rights America. We need the civil rights movement today more than ever before, and we need SCLC today more than ever before. Now to answer your question. I'm here on behalf of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. We publish newspapers every week. 206 African American owned newspapers in print. We reach 20 million people a week, all over the United States. And of course, now with the digital age, we're also complementing what we do in print, utilizing social media. So, over the last several months, we've written many articles about the need for criminal justice reform. Personally, I have a syndicated column. I've also written about the subject matter. But we need to do more than just write columns and print articles. We have to organize a movement. And I'm going to say on the record, I have no problem. In fact, I am very pleased to sit on the stage with representatives of Coke Industries. I believe that people have to put their money where their mouth is. We've got a lot of people who mouth criminal justice reform, not putting up one dime. So I thank the Koch brothers for what they have done to help emerge this bipartisan movement. And some of you know, I'm probably the only one on the panel who has been in prison for a number of years. So I'm not speaking out of some theoretical proposition. I'm speaking to you today from what I've seen in my own personal life, because I spent most of the 1970s in prison as a member of the Wilmington, North Carolina 10, unjustly, by the way. But the fact of the matter is, I got a chance to see the prison system from what it does to destroy people. There is no rehabilitation in the prison. In fact, the criminal justice system itself today, as it's presently organized, contributes to crime in America, contributes to deterioration of America, contributes to poverty in America, contributes to destroying families in America, contributes to destroying communities in America. So at the top of our agenda, at the top of our policy agenda, has to be the reform of the criminal justice system. Because to reform the criminal justice system in America is to reform America, is to make justice, freedom, and equality much more accessible to our brothers and sisters in our community. So yes, we're going to join Brother Curley from the Newspaper Publishers Association. We say we're the voice of the black community. I want a stronger voice. And I want to say to Dr. Steele, president of SCLC, please see the NNPA as your partner, you know, your advocate. Well, there's a lot that's not going right now in our country. And a lot of it stems from racial profiling, a lot of it stems from prosecutorial misconduct, a lot of it stems from police brutality, a lot of it stems to, and as a religious person, as a minister, I have to say that while I was in prison, I was asked by the Shaw Observer, what was the #1 lesson I learned while I was in prison? You know what I said, Dr. Steele? I said I learned something about the oneness of humanity. I learned something about the oneness of God. There was a time when people did not believe that South Africa could dismantle apartheid. But it took somebody like Nelson Mandela, it took somebody like the ANC to work, even though they were the majority of the population, They did not persecute the minority and white population. And that's why they had a relatively peaceful transformation of apartheid. If you look at the criminal justice system in America, you're looking at American apartheid. You're looking at a situation that stems and consigns people, not even after they serve their time, cannot get a job. Even after they serve their time, cannot enter a quality life. So they still serving time, even after they're out of prison. Prison goes with them the rest of their life. And that's why, again, the rest of corporate America ought to take lead from what the coke industry has done, because they not only put some money up to reform the criminal justice system, they've made it now, if you want to work for the coke industry, you don't have to have a block to check to see if you have a criminal background. We need that for all companies. I know some of you don't respect me because I'm known as one of the student militants. I'm not a student now, but I feel like I'm still a militant. I think that it's time for black people to stand up and unite with people who unite with us, and let's try to make a critical difference to make our society. This country is worth fighting for. This country is worth transforming. We've participated, shed too much blood to get the right to vote, to get to participate, and we're not going to let some judge, some prosecutor, some misguided prison warden hold us down and keep us down. It's time to reform the criminal justice system, and it's time to do it now.
So with that, no, that's all right. You're working right with me, so that's great. No, what do you see then in light of this as the most critical aspects of the criminal justice system that must be reformed?
Okay, that's quite an eloquent statement to follow, and I'm not going to try to match that, but I agree with every single word that was said, 100%. I'll tell you what I think. Two things, maybe three. One, on the global side, we have to change the national mindset about the criminal justice system. We have, as you heard, we over-criminalize. That means we make too many things criminal that don't need to be. We ought to be using our criminal law to deal with basic bad behavior, dangerous behavior, theft, and physical attacks on other people. We over-prosecute. We over-incarcerate. We over-penalize even when we don't incarcerate. And we have generally engaged in an overindulgence in the use and the misuse of our criminal justice system. We need to change that mindset. We also need to change the way we think about people who do break the law. You don't take somebody who makes a mistake and throw them away or put them in a place, as Mark said, where they're only going to come out worse, with less opportunity or less chance. We have to demand of our politicians that we stop this anger vengeance approach to criminal justice. People are human. They make mistakes. They change. They grow. They mature. Anybody who has ever had a teenager and seen them grow 10 years old, anyone who's ever been a teenager, you know what I'm talking about. You have an 18-year-old. That 18-year-old is not the same at 28 or 38. But we've got this incredibly angry approach that we take, and that's just wrong. So we've got to change that. The change in the national mindset has also got to look at this back end. I don't want people to overlook the back end, the collateral consequences of what we call it, collateral damage, really, of having contact with the criminal justice system. We have allowed these countless tens of thousands of laws, state, local, and federal, to deprive people who have been through the system of fundamental rights, so that their ability to work, to get jobs, to get housing, to raise families, to keep families together, to maintain their legal status, it's gone. And it's not only felonies, by the way. A lot of misdemeanors contribute to these things. And we have allowed this to happen. We, the public, we have remained silent. We have to demand of the politicians that they do away with it. And then I want to turn to one other issue that I really think is critical, and I'm afraid that the public doesn't really get it. And it's this whole business of the indigent defense system. I mentioned it briefly, Mark mentioned it. Let me be very clear about what we're talking about. So the Constitution says that every person shall enjoy the right to counsel. And that is, in fact, the word that's in there. And by the way, it doesn't say every innocent person. It doesn't say every maybe innocent person. It says every person. And there's a reason for that. The people who, they didn't get everything right, the founders of this country, but they got a few things right. And one of the things they got right was that they understood that there is no more awesome use of the power of the government, short of warfare, than to prosecute and condemn someone. And they decided that it was critically important that every person who is being prosecuted by their government have a professional advocate to stand between them and the government. Now that right didn't become real until about 50 years ago in a case called Gideon, when the Supreme Court said that you have a right to counsel. If you're too poor, you have to have a lawyer appointed for you. But the Supreme Court never told the states how to implement that. And today, in a country, as I said, where we arrest 14 million people a year, over 80% of the people who go through the criminal justice system depend upon some form of appointed counsel. But because there's no mandatory funding for this, in most of the states, the indigent defense system isn't even a system. In this state in particular, Louisiana, there are parishes right now where the caseloads that lawyers are carrying are monstrously over any known standard. They are underpaid, they are understaffed. And what is so important about this is it's not because you need a lawyer to get you off. It's because you need a lawyer to advocate for you. As Mark pointed out, over 95% of the cases are disposed of. People are pleading guilty. Part of that is because they don't have lawyers to fight for them. They sometimes sit in jail for months without a lawyer in this country. And it's not just Louisiana. It's Mississippi. It's California, where a lawsuit was just brought in Fresno. It's my home state of New York. My home state of New York, where I have fought for indigent defense reform for years. We have got to, as a society, the people have got to demand that this right be upheld. The lawyer has the ability to work with a young kid and find what is the underlying pathology, get them into a program, find a way to prevent them from having that criminal record that's gonna ruin their lives. But we don't ever think about that. And it's funny, you know, people will fight for housing, and they'll fight for health care, and they'll fight for jobs. None of those things, by the way, are in the Constitution. We don't have a constitutional right to a job. We don't have a constitutional right to health care or housing. But we have a constitutional right to a lawyer when we're accused of a crime, and we don't fight to enforce that. So I am pleading with you, as you go back to your communities, find out what's going on with your indigent defense system, find out how it's being funded, and ask the politicians, why are you not supporting something where if you invest $1 in that, you will save $5 down the road. It's such a good investment to try to help these folks on the front end before they go into the system. I think that's common sense, and I know it's required by our Constitution. And I'll tell you something, we have got to be willing to make this something that is the #1 issue of our time. Nobody should ever be convicted of a crime, even a misdemeanor that doesn't carry jail time, unless they have had a fully resourced, quality attorney.
Lauren, obviously, President Obama has successfully tackled health care, same-sex marriage, and reopening diplomatic relations with Cuba. So it seems as if the criminal justice issues is poised to be the president's next big platform. With a Republican-dominated Congress, do you think his support of this issue will hurt or help the cause?
The way that our system of government is set up, his job in this, particularly if, say, something like the Safe Justice Act were to get into the House and the Senate, which is probably the most likely criminal justice bill to make it, because it has right now 36 sponsors and it's split Democrat and Republican. So that's rare that you have, 15 Democrats and Republicans on a bill. But anyway, the way that things are set up in this particular example, it's probably best for the president to keep quiet and just wait for the bill to show up to his desk. Because quite frankly, what happens when he amplifies the issue, you just get Republicans scared to support it, or coming up with some excuse not to support it. And he doesn't really need to do anything except wait for it to show up. When the Fair Sentencing Act passed in 2010, which made the crack powder cocaine penalty go from 1 100 to 118, he was fairly quiet during that. It showed up, it was worked on, Dick Durbin and Bobby Scott and some other members of the House and Senate. And of course, most of the members in the Congressional Black Caucus wanted it to be 1-1, not 118. There's really no reason for there to be any difference in the crack powder penalty. But anyway, the president was quiet, and that quiet strategy worked just fine. And quite frankly, it can work just fine with this. His job is to basically just put his hand on the paper and sign it. And he's the right president for that now. Some of these things could have come up during Clinton, during Bush. Bush didn't do too bad. He did sign the Second Chance Act, which was a bill that still gets funded to help people when they first come out of prison. But he wasn't an activist. Bush wasn't an activist about criminal justice, and quite frankly, neither is President Obama until very recently. But really, the work of these bills, the work of this legislation, the real nitty-gritty happens with members of Congress when it comes to federal policy. So the personalities and the drama and the staff yelling at each other and all of that, which is what I've been learning about on the Safe Justice Act over the last few weeks, that all happens, you know, in some back office someplace, in some telephone conversation nobody knows about. It's not that the administration isn't involved at all, and it's nice to see the president come out and talk about these things publicly. I'm not saying it's not nice to see it. It's great to see it, but from a bare-knuckle political standpoint, it's best for him to keep as quiet as possible on this particular issue, because, you know, bipartisanship is a big thing here. Just like Holden was saying about, you know, how the system is, you know, there's so many issues on the back end of our system. I actually think when I look at some of these bills and look at the criminal justice system, the more important issue is to stop people from getting into the system in the first place. And when you have pieces of legislation, there's a piece of legislation called the Youth Promise Act, for example, that Louisiana's own David Vitter, a Republican, is the Senate sponsor of. And that's a prevention bill, a pure prevention bill. Some of these pieces of legislation deal with things after somebody is in the system. But there are pieces out there, like the Youth Promise Act, that try to prevent that from even happening in the first place. Because once you get in the system in our country right now, you have it's very problematic to shake that off or get your record expunged. Those things are very difficult to do. But at any rate, a lot of these bills do have Republicans on them. And frankly, with the Safe Justice Act, with the Koch brothers being involved, now you have Republicans paying attention. Because frankly, there are two languages that these politicians understand. I don't care if it's federal or state. The two languages are votes and money. That's what they pay attention to, votes and money. And the black community, with regard to black advocacy, we may not have the money piece, but we've got the vote piece. And it may surprise you. I think people get shocked that, you know, they get the idea that, oh, if I wrote a letter to my member of Congress, it's really not going to make a difference. Oh, yes, it will. Because when you write that individual letter, they know in their minds, whoa, there's somebody out there paying attention. And that one letter represents maybe 5 or 6 other people. So imagine what happens if you have 5 or 6 people who write something. And people pay attention to their letters in these offices. They pay attention to their phone calls. You know, I think people have a sense that, you know, these politicians don't really listen to these things. It really doesn't matter. It does matter. I've worked in congressional offices, and I've seen what they do when people call in. Even if it's like 2 or 3 people, but when a letter comes in, it's an even bigger deal. But, you know, in the black community, because the black agenda sometimes is ignored in favor of other people's agendas, we have to pay attention to the fact that, you know, black women were the highest percentage of voters in 2012. I mean, we vote, we come out and vote. And we have to pay attention to we have to meet that voting strategy with specific issues and specific policy and specific bills, not generalities. Stop there.
Mark, Ben alluded to this earlier, but earlier this year, Koch did ban the box on its employment applications. Can you tell us why you did that? And what's the company's history been regarding hiring people who have had a felony record?
Yeah. Before I talk about that, I do want to follow up on what Lauren said. We had a great meeting with the White House. My colleague Jenny Kim was sitting here, and I did back in April. Roy Austin, who I don't know, he works in domestic policy at the White House. He invited us in after we were at a criminal justice summit with him. We had a great meeting with him and Valerie Jarrett, Cecilia Munoz, and Neil Eggleston, where we talked about a number of issues, including ban the box. And I just want to say personally, I think that what the president's doing is great. I think it's great that he showed up in prison last week. He's powerful testimony, a powerful message. And when he said what he said about there for the grace of God, that's true. And I know for me, I think of all of us. So I understand what Laura's saying politically with some Republicans. I get that. I'm glad he did, and I think he should be applied for it personally. That's my position. The box issue. We removed it from our application, and we did that because we didn't think it was just or fair, given how our system is set up. That whole litany of things I went through earlier about how our laws are passed and implemented, what we criminalize, and who gets picked up for violating those laws. We don't think that system is fair to begin with. What we've learned over time is when people have issues in their past, they come up during the interview process. We want to get to know the whole person. We want to know who they are now. We want to get to understand what brought them to the place they are now, and we don't overly fixate on something they may have done in the past. We've all made mistakes. I've made mistakes. Everyone in this room has made a mistake. Depending on who you are, what area code, what zip code, what neighborhood you live in, the type of mistake you make could be nothing, or it could be a felony, the way it works these days. So with all that in mind, and the fact that when we work to find out the best applicants, to find the best people to hire, we have those discussions back and forth. These issues usually come up. People front them. People bring them up with you. We talk about it, and then we look at the whole person. We look at, what did they do? What was it? What happened? What role are they in? What role are they looking for now? Can they add value to our company in that role? And we all have our issues, our imperfections. That's part of the package. That's why we banned the box on our application. I've been with the company 20 years, and before I was in the role I'm in now, I worked on labor and employment issues. And during that time, I can tell you all, these questions would come up. Someone, when we had the box was checked, people would call and say, what do we do? I said, we're going to follow what the EEOC says. We're going to follow common sense. We're going to talk to this person. We're going to find out what happened. We're going to find out what the role is now, and we're going to see if they're the right fit for the role. Because you make a mistake in your past shouldn't mean that you're precluded from ever having another opportunity to help us be a better company or help yourself get ahead in life. And the final thing I'll say about this for us is that as an employer, obviously, a very competitive workplace here in the United States, marketplace for talent. It's a global economy. It would be short-sighted for us as a company if we're going to just say, hey, someone made a mistake in the past, don't even bother applying. We're missing out on a lot of talent, opportunity, a lot of people who could do great things for us and for our company. So for all those reasons, just from a strictly business sense, from trying to give people a break, recognizing the flaws in our system and the inequities in our system, it made sense for us to do it. We encourage other companies to do it. We think it makes a lot of sense. We know that, we're very proud of our workforce, the people we hire, the people we bring in. And whether they have a criminal record or not at the end of the day shouldn't preclude them from being able to work with us, assuming they're the right fit for the job.
Ben, and I'm going to get to the audience questions. I've got a number of those here, but let me just ask you this one question. Why should the criminal justice reform be imparted to the average American? And why should they even care?
Thank you. Before I answer your question, I just want to recognize I see my senior editor-in-chief of the Black Press USA, the Black Wild, the National Newspaper Publishers Association, just came in. Give a hand to George Curry. He's been many articles about criminal justice reform, and I'm sure he was going to write many more. Also, I see Melanie Campbell, let's just give her a hand, Black voter participation. What Ron said is true. At the end of the day, we got to go to the polls on this issue. And I think that this issue is important to all Americans for three reasons, Curly. One, we spend $80 billion a year, $80 billion, locking people up. That's enough money that all these young people in here and every young people in every community could go to college tuition free. There's something wrong with our priorities. There's something wrong with our national priorities. When we spend that kind of money, most of whom that are locked up should not be locked up in the first place. And then you label that person, you profile that person for the rest of their life. That is wrong. It's a sin before God. And we need to correct it. Number two reason why most Americans should be in favor of criminal justice reform is because of the health of our economy. Right now, the criminal justice system is an impediment to the American economy. We wonder why other countries are more productive than the United States of America. You have to look at what we're doing inside to our own people. They have over 2 million people in prison, with 5% of the world's population, with 25% of the prison population in the world. Something is wrong with that. That should be embarrassing to the average American to know that we live in a nation that only represents 5% of the world's population, but yet we put 25% of the world's population in prison in our nation. Is that what it means to be an American? Is that what it means to be in the land of the free and the home of the brave? That seems the antithesis of that statement. This is the land of the imprisoned. This is the land of cowards. We need courage. I know a little something about movement building. And that's why I think it's fitting, Dr. Steele, that this discussion is taking place in the heart of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We got to build a movement for criminal justice reform. If we want these members of Congress to vote for the Safe Justice Act, we got to put some fire under them. And that's not only going to happen when we build a movement. We have to vote. We have to keep pressure on these legislators. The Safe Justice Act is only part. It's not a total reform. That's a step. We need systematic reform of the criminal justice system. One other thing I was just to say, in the audience is Craig DeRoche. Craig, stand up, raise your hand. Now, he inherited, I was on the plane with him coming down. You know, I normally don't introduce white people. I normally don't. Because my whole career is advocating for black folks. But I've gotten a little older now, and I realize that in order to advocate for black folks, you got to advocate for all folks. And so, he inherited the ministry of Chuck Colson. Some of y'all may not know who Chuck Colson was. He was involved with the Watergate. You know, Watergate was a dark period in our nation's history. Nixon was president. But Charles Colson went through that and came back and started a prison ministry. When people weren't talking about criminal justice reform, when people weren't talking about what we're talking about today, I'm talking about decades ago. Charles Colson put a prison ministry involved, and I saw the work when I was in prison in North Carolina of that prison ministry getting inmates not to see themselves as enemies because of the difference in race. And I'm telling you, a lot of what is going on in America today, one is out of ignorance, it's out of lack of education, it's out of lack of not seeing one another as brothers and sisters. You know, we see we're supposed to be our brother's keeper, our sister's keeper, but do we really believe that? One of the challenges, Dr. Steele, you're going to have in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is to get the black church back on the front line of the struggle of the civil rights movement. We got too many quiet Christian people. You know, who's singing the faith. It's one thing to sing Amazing Grace. There's another thing to make Amazing Grace in the lives of everybody. See what I'm saying? That's the challenge, to change this community on criminal justice reform. So I see this movement emerging. It's going to be bipartisan. I see Republicans, Democrats, Independents. I see young people. I see old people. I see people across lines of race joining this movement. Because that's what it's going to take to change this centuries-old problem. So I don't think the problem with mass incarceration just started with the Rockefeller drug laws. I think it's deeper than that. You know? And I think, and I would just say to my brothers and sisters in here, in the African American community, there's something wrong with former slaves that don't want to leave former slave masters' plantations. Yeah. You know, a lot of these prisons have become plantations. And a lot of us have this plantation mentality. And that's why we celebrate the way we think we can't exist without these jails and prisons. And to the young people, I'm not talking to you because I hope you will reject that in your life. But there are too many of us who are too comfortable with this issue. You know, we wait till some tragedy happens and police brutality, and then we get excited because it's caught on videotape. What is wrong with us? We ought to be mad. We ought to be angry. But we ought to be challenge our anger, challenge our madness as something constructive that would change this situation. We reform this prison system. I guarantee you it'll change the quality of life in our community for many decades to come. Thank you.
I committed to the audience to get to that question, so I'm going to start with those now. And feel free, any one of the panelists who'd like to respond to do so. First question, in fact, several members have asked this question. Along with the damaging effects of mass incarceration in federal prisons, what would you say is the current trend in addressing private prisons? Should we disconnect the profit motive from the criminal justice system? Mark?
You know, it was interesting when we first got involved, or we've been involved in criminal justice reform for 12 years, but when it first got a little more public this past 6 months, when my new friends on the other side of the aisle, including Van Jones, Center for American Progress, and other groups, Van asked me a question at a summit in D.C., and it was, what's your angle? What's in this for you guys? You guys gonna make a lot of money on prisons? And you know, my answer was no. But I mean, if we're not involved in the prison industry, period. But if we were, do you think we want to reform the system? No, we want jaywalking to be a felony, right? So we're not involved. And here's my point of view. When I read about whether it's private prisons or they're farmed out, privatized probation practices and services, where the incentives, it's all about incentives, everything you do, right? Where the incentives for the private prisons or the private probation provider is keep people locked up more, keep their hooks in a little more, not let them be free. That can't happen. Not going to work. Never. If you run a private prison, you should not be paid based on how many people you got in your prison.
That's right.
You should be paid if you go back. You know, personally, whether it's a private or public prison, it goes back to me what I said earlier. Your job is to make the person better when they come out, when they came in. That's the only metric that matters. If you're not doing that, we're going to fire you. We'll bring someone in who will do that because that's your responsibility. The prison system's a mess. But when I read about private prisons, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I'm reading about it, that they are getting incentivized by how many people they have locked up, how many beds they're filling.
That's right.
It's just wrong. I got a question back at another summit. Someone asked me, they're closing a lot of prisons in Texas. They asked Van Jones and me this question. They're closing a lot of prisons in Texas. What's your point of view on that? And Van said, Mark, why don't you handle this one? And what I said was, that's good. I'm sorry people are losing jobs, but that means people are free. It means that we've decided that these people being free will enhance public safety, honor the Bill of Rights, treat them as individuals. That's our goal, to get people free, to keep them out of prison. So any incentives that are set up for people to be incarcerated longer or to be on probation, some ticky-tack-follow type thing, doesn't work, doesn't make sense. So I think prisons, public or private, I work in a public one, they're not pleasant places, but their job should be to make the person better, whether it's public or private. But if it's to make money off of people being incarcerated and not free for no other reason, just to keep them in, that is morally wrong and repugnant, and it shouldn't happen.
One of the other questions from the audience that's trying to tie the session that preceded this in the session is tying both sessions together. How can the indigent defense system help young girls who may have been arrested by being involved in the sex trafficking?
Well, I think the answer to that is very simple, and it really goes back to what I was saying before. Everybody needs to have a strong and effective advocate who has the time and the resources to understand why they are in front of the court in the first place. And if you're going to uncover what has led this person into that place. You're going to do it through a lawyer. You're not going to do it by putting them up in front of a judge or a prosecutor and having them sentenced. So I think there really is a genuine nexus there. I think the important thing that we have to understand with this vast number of arrests, with under-resourcing the availability of counsel for the poor, is that we've created in this country a conviction mill. We have what are called meet, greet, and plead practices, and I guarantee you there are people in this audience that know exactly what I'm talking about, where you show up in court, and if you get a lawyer, you get that lawyer 3 minutes before you stand before the judge. And before you know it, you're pleading guilty and you're on your way, either to jail or out of the courthouse with a record. That's not what the Sixth Amendment was about. That's not what we should be doing, and I think it would address that problem as well if we actually said, you know what, you really are entitled to a lawyer. You shouldn't have people pleading guilty at first appearances, and most of all, you shouldn't be using bail as a ransom, which is, you know, we talk about the number of people in jail in this country. You know that over half of them are in jail while they're still presumed innocent. They haven't even been convicted. We got to address that.
Yeah, I just want to add, first of all, I agree that every defendant ought to have a good lawyer, and particularly a lawyer that's going to represent your interests. Sometimes, unfortunately, what you've got to fix, the court-appointed lawyer situation, the lawyer is appointed to represent you, but the lawyer is really representing the state and plea bargaining you away. But I want to say something to the non-lawyers. Scripture says, what you do unto the least of these, you do also unto me. We're all supposed to be advocates for those who are less fortunate, for those who get caught up in the situation. Every time I go to the Bronx and to the court system, I think I'm in Mississippi. We're nothing but the defendants. But yet, and the system does not represent any kind of inequity. It's just a kind of business as usual to warehouse people, to lock people up, and the people get stacked up. I'm glad they're going to eliminate records, hopefully, in employment. But some people's records are so long, it takes almost a thick thing because they've been arrested so many times. And I just think that we are in a society that has a proclivity to lock people up, proclivity to punish people when they should not be punished. And unfortunately, if you're African American, as it is proven lately, you will lose your life. I mean, there's a young woman in Texas who allegedly didn't use a signal light to change a lane. And then because she's smoking a cigarette, the officer gets excited, but now she's dead. That is wrong. That is wrong. And unfortunately, for the vast majority of 45 million African Americans, I think we are too comfortable. We're too waiting for the next incident to happen. You know, I think we got to, again, I appeal to our civil rights organizations, particularly SCLC. We have to do something about this. This is a sense of urgency for criminal justice reform. This is not an intellectual discussion, a debate on an academic topic. We're talking about human lives. We're talking about life and death. And we should always choose life over death.
One of the other questions is the use of the grand jury. The district attorney has shown that entity to be bankrupt. What are your thoughts about fixing or replacing the grand jury?
Well, I think Mark alluded to this when he talked about, you know, the process that unfolds. Grand jury system is completely broken in this country. It was intended to be both the shield and the sword. It was supposed to protect people at the same time that it was also a prosecutorial tool. But it has become, unfortunately, a rubber stamp. It's a very famous chief judge in my home state of New York, who once said a grand jury can indict a ham sandwich, except if the individual who's accused is a police officer, in which case it doesn't indict. Now, there's a problem there. There's a problem with a system that is not functioning the way it was intended to be functioning. And there are a lot of great ideas that are being talked about what can be done to fix it, and what can be done to have some safeguards. There's no question that what it was originally intended to be, it no longer is. I mean, in a federal grand jury, there's virtually no rights. Some of the states have give you a few rights, but it is clearly a very, very broken system.
I'd just like to add to that, the system is dysfunctional, and it is, I guess I'd say it's almost an equal opportunity destroyer, because we know what happens. You all probably have stories, I know I do, people I know, our company, we felt like we got railroaded. But U.S. Senator Ted Stevens, who was a sitting U.S. Senator, was tried and convicted about a half mile from where he sat in the Senate, and it turned out afterwards that the government, the Department of Justice, had hidden vast sums and amounts of exculpatory information or evidence that would have shown he was innocent. And ultimately, the trial judge vacated his verdict. He lost his Senate seat, he died thereafter. The two prosecutors were suspended. One of them committed suicide, the other went back to work. So there's so many things you could talk about in the grand jury process. It gets back to, for me, just going back to the Bill of Rights. We have a system now which is way too much power in the prosecutor. It needs to go back to where it was intended, to the court system, to the judges, to let them make decisions, particularly these types of decisions about people's life, liberty, and property. And now you've got judges who are, because of mandatory minimums, 3 strikes and you're outlaws, or whatever else, their hands are tied. That's wrong. And we know the process leading in. I'm not saying all prosecutors, I think there's a lot of good ones, most of them probably get it right. So our system, there's no room for error, because what is at stake? And we know there are violations all the time of these rules about turning over information, providing information. We know they play games in the grand jury process where they present information they know would never be admissible at trial in order to indict you. And as we've talked about, the indictment's the ball game these days. Because once you're indicted, you probably can't afford to go to trial, or wouldn't want a chance going to trial because you'd be locked up for the rest of your life, the whole trial penalty. So I don't know if this is a legislative fix. I think part of it will start when we get the sentencing right again and have our court system take over that aspect of it. And then I do think that some prosecutors should not have absolute immunity from prosecution for violating the Constitution and violating people's civil rights. I think that needs to change as well. That'd be a piece of legislation. There's others, but in the interest of time, I'll stop now. Thank you.
And in fact, Mark, in the interest of time, this will be our last question. And I'm going to tie this question to one of the questions that came from the audience as well. In this country, once a person served their criminal sentence, aren't they given a clean slate? And if not, why not? And what problems result from that? And a specific question from the audience, when will we see voting rights restored? Anyone want to answer the panel?
On voting rights, unfortunately, what that comes down to is that the Congress has to fix what the Supreme Court wrote with Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. There was actually, interestingly enough, one of the Republican leaders in the House indicated that he might actually want to put sort of a hint that didn't seem all that deep to me. What it requires, of course, is that the Republicans who now control the House and the Senate would have to move on that. That's highly, highly unlikely. I mean, I think anything can happen, but that's highly unlikely. What was the first question? Sorry.
Once you've served your time, you're out.
Well, obviously, we live in a country where you serve your time and it lives with you for the rest of your life. I mean, as we learned with Michelle Alexander's book, New Jim Crow, which I think actually sort of kicked off a new era of thinking about the criminal justice system. The system is set up so that if you have a felony, it makes it very difficult to re-enter for one reason or another. You're not only, having trouble, obviously, with employment, that's an obvious one, but there are other things like getting college loans, getting housing, getting public housing, and it just sort of extends into everything. So the obvious answer there is that, once you have a felony on your record, you make it very difficult for people to re-enter. I think most people here know that. And that's one of the reasons why, when you lead the world in the rate of incarceration, you have 2.3 million people behind bars, you have to figure out something. You know, we basically are hurting ourselves, obviously, with this, in terms of productivity in this country, when you have 2.3 million people behind bars. And then you have the fact that even when they get out, you're actually punishing them. And obviously in the black community, this has a generational effect, because it hurts the chances economically of a lot of our black males out there when they're disproportionately policed and disproportionately arrested. And, you know, I'm from New York, and I have a bunch of cops in my family, including my father, who worked at Reimer Island for 20 years. And you saw what happened in New York over 10 years with stop and frisk. You know, you stop somebody, effectively, if you only focus on blacks and Latinos and stop and frisk, obviously the statistics are going to show up on the other end that those people, you know, you're going to have some disproportion on the other end. So we know, I think, in this audience, what happens, how hard it is for people to re-enter. Yes, there's legislation. Yes, there's policy to make some of that better when people get out. But really, the answer is to not get them in the first place and stop over-policing people. And this thing with Sandra Bland, perfect example. She didn't have to be stopped at all. It's an over-policing case. You know, it's effectively a vehicular example of stop and frisk. Why did he stop her in the first place? So it's just getting somebody into the system, and you know, obviously we have a situation where it affects that person's life from that point forward right now.
Excuse me 1 second. I said the last question, but I know someone who walked in that I respect a lot and has helped me a great deal, came in late before we gave the action, Ms. Rita Samuels. And Melanie Campbell, both of you there, I know that have a question you'd like to ask, and I'll ask this gentleman, and we'll make that the last question. Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you all so very much for this wonderful day. And I want to give them a hand along with you. This is really an important issue, and I want to thank you, Mr. Dossman, for your involvement in this and for all of the town's involvement. I would like to know, what is the next step for how we move this important initiative? What can we do as far as our states are concerned? You know, states can do things outside, we all